Before talking about the history of the hand, I want first to pay tribute to that great scholar of research on the hand, Professor Brian Kemp, our former president, who sadly died last year. He did so much for this society and to stimulate interest in the Abbey. Here he is on a forward trip to Lewes, when we also visited Clayton Church, where he is explaining the wonderful 12th century wall paintings. You may recognize a few of his audience. He was a brilliant guide, and his knowledge was encyclopedic. From the 1970s, Brian's work centered on the cartularies of Reading Abbey, and he also translated and wrote about the miracles of the hand of St. James, one of our chief sources of knowledge about the Abbey. Last year, not very long before his death, he brought out what was to be his final work, Reading Abbey Records, a New Miscellany, which includes the miracles both in Latin and English, along with other fascinating records. Some years ago, the Confraternity of St. James, a society of those who have walked the Camino to Compostela in Spain, held a conference at St. James's Church, and by special permission, the hand was brought to be displayed. Brian was invited to give a talk about the seals of Reading Abbey, some of which, for example this one, show the hand, and he brought his vintage carousel projector to show his collection of slides. However, when he invited questions at the end of the talk, he was rightly irritated that nearly all of them related to the relic rather than to the seals. The discovery of the hand was made in October 1786, when parts of the Abbey were being knocked down to build the first Reading County jail. Some workmen discovered, hidden in one of the flint walls, a box containing a left human hand in a mummified condition. A Reading physician, Dr. Hooper, acquired the hand and placed it in the Antiquarian Museum, where it apparently lay next to a dried fish for some years, labelled as the Hand of St. James the Apostle. In 1848 it was purchased from Dr. Hooper's family for £50 by a Catholic gentleman, a Mr. Mackenzie, who was a friend of Mr. Scott Murray of Danesfield near Henley. Mr. Mackenzie was hoping to display it in his private chapel at Dingwall in Scotland. 7 years later, in 1855, while travelling northwards, Mr. Mackenzie stopped off on Christmas Eve at the Birmingham Oratory, which had been founded in 1849 by John Henry Newman, later cardinal and now saint. One of the priests there offered a view of the relic, apparently described it as quite oriental in appearance and slightly feminine. He thought that the hand looked too delicate to be that of the rough, toiling fisherman, St. James the Greater, but suggested that it might be that of our Lord's cousin, St. James the Less, whom he must have assumed to have had smaller hands. Mr. Mackenzie seems to have spent Christmas at the Oratory before continuing his journey to Scotland. Unfortunately, Mr. Mackenzie's ownership of the hand was brief. The Oratory priests reported that less than a month later, on the 22nd of January, while visiting a church he was building, he and 2 priest friends were entertained to a roast beef dinner at the local provost's house, at which the horseradish sauce made by the cook had accidentally been made with monkshood, a deadly poison. 3 of the guests, including Mackenzie, died. It seems that there had already been dark predictions about the bad luck supposedly associated with the relic, shades of the curse of Tutankhamun. The hand then reverted to Mr. Scott Murray of Danesfield. But in the late 19th century, he was obliged to leave that house by pecuniary issues, and he donated the relic to St. Peter's Church in Marlow, built by the Scott Murray family. That is where it remains today. It is kept in a glass case, which always reminds me of Snow White's glass coffin. And now the spoiler alert. In 2018, a radiocarbon dating study was made by the Oxford University Research Laboratory for Archaeology and the History of Art, which revealed that the hand could not be from the early years of Christianity, but that it dated from the late 10th to early 11th century. This does not, however, mean that the relic is not the hand which was kept at Reading Abbey, as we shall see. So, who was St. James? This wall painting from a monastery in the Sinai Peninsula tells us something about his special status in the Gospels. James, the brother of John, was one of the fishermen who were the first disciples to be called by Jesus. Matthew's Gospel tells us that they were in the boat with their father, Zebedee, mending their nets, and that they immediately stood up and followed Jesus. Zebedee's reaction to this sudden departure is not reported, but as the two young men were known as Boanerges, the sons of thunder, or literally in Hebrew, the sons of wrath, we may imagine he was less than happy. It's also possible that the epithet refers to James and his brother's own personalities. They are recorded as arguing elsewhere in the Gospels. At the Transfiguration, Jesus took his three closest friends up a mountain, where he was seen talking to Moses and Elijah in a blaze of light. After Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension into heaven, the Acts of the Apostles, said to have been written by the evangelist Luke, give an account of the growth of the early church. In chapter 12, Luke reports that about that time, but the date is unspecified, King Herod laid violent hands upon some who belonged to the church. He had James, the brother of John, killed with the sword. James's martyrdom is depicted in this painting by the 15th century French miniaturist Jean Fouquet, who peoples the scene with characters and even churches from his own time. The story of what happened to James's body now becomes more complicated. In what Ron Baxter describes as the official version, James was buried in a rock tomb in Jerusalem, identified as such in this 1919 photo. The Armenian Cathedral of St. James in Jerusalem claims to hold the saint's head, said to lie beneath the red marble roundel at the foot of the picture, which is still reverently kissed by pilgrims. However, the Spanish legend is that the body, which in this 12th century sculpture is shown with a head, was placed in a stone boat by two of his disciples, who had previously accompanied him on a missionary journey to Spain, and that the boat miraculously floated across the Mediterranean, through the Pillars of Hercules, and up the Atlantic coast to Galicia, where it was taken inland and buried. According to the legend, the grave was discovered in the 9th century by a hermit called Pelayo, who was alerted to its presence by a field of stars, hence Compostela, and told his bishop of the miracle. You can see an angel censing the tomb for the bishop. This suspiciously convenient account coincides with the beginnings of the Reconquista, the long campaign to recover Christian Spain from the Muslim Umayyad dynasty. In the year 1000, it has been estimated that 75% of the population of Spain was Muslim, many unwillingly so. The site of James's grave was, however, always in Christian hands. It is not known why and when the scallop shell became the symbol of pilgrimage to James's tomb. It was originally the symbol of the goddess Venus. Think of Botticelli's Birth of Venus. Statues of St. James, like this one at Le Puy, depict him wearing the scallop shell in his hat. The scallop was not only a badge allowing hospitality at pilgrim hostels, it could also be used as a scoop for water and a plate for meals. The grooves in the shell also indicated the network of routes leading to the shrine at Compostela. From Germany, the Jakobsweg, from France, the Camino Frances, and even from England, although this was a pilgrimage largely confined to wealthy people. This is the modern network of Camino routes, now designated as official European long-distance footpaths and waymarked by the scallop shell motif, all leading to the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela. All along the medieval routes to Compostela there were hostels, many manned by Cluniac monks, which catered to the needs of pilgrims. There is no doubt that pilgrimage to Compostela had an anti-Islamic element, particularly in Spain, but also in France, where the 11th century Chanson de Roland kept alive the memory of Charlemagne's victory over the Muslims at the Battle of Roncevaux in 778. From the 11th century there were stories of Saint James, Santiago in Spanish, appearing on a white horse before battles and sieges, occasionally accompanied by Saint George. The cult of Santiago Matamoros, the Moor slayer, became a blatantly anti-Islamic devotion and is still a source of tension. This Baroque statue of Santiago in the cathedral at Compostela shows him trampling on the heads of defeated Moors. A few years ago it was suggested that the statue be removed to a museum to avoid offence to Muslims, but after great calls of political correctness gone mad, it was allowed to remain, though the base of the statue is apparently always surrounded by flowers. However, in this picture one head can still be seen poking out. We now need to return to the official version of what happened to James's body, and specifically his hand. After the legalization of Christianity by Constantine, the Roman and Jewish perception of the bodies of the dead as unclean, polluting, and therefore untouchable began to be replaced, especially in the Eastern Church, by a veneration of the remains of saints, seen, as Eamon Duffy says, as a pledge of future resurrection and a source of power and blessing. In the 7th century, the parish of Altino, an old Roman settlement in the Veneto region of northern Italy, held what was believed to be the arm of St. James. It was said to have been brought there by Heliodorus, a colleague of St. Jerome, in the late 4th century, after he had visited James's grave in Jerusalem. In the year 640, faced with Lombard invasions, the Bishop of Altino and his whole Christian community took refuge on the island of Torcello in the Venetian lagoon, where Heliodorus had been buried. The relic was brought with them and was kept in the beautiful Byzantine basilica, which came to be adorned with stunning devotional mosaics. This is where the arm relic remained until 1046, when Adalbert, the German Bishop of Bremen and Hamburg, visited Torcello on his way to Rome. He was accompanying Emperor Heinrich III, who was on his way to oversee the election of a new pope. The Bishop of Torcello, Vitale Unciolo, was persuaded to offer the relic to Adalbert, who took it back to Germany. However, it is significant that from this point, sources refer not to an arm relic, this is a much later arm reliquary, but to the hand of St. James. Here is a later example of a medieval hand reliquary. In view of the carbon dating results of the Marlow relic, it's entirely possible that a switch was made in order to keep the original arm in Torcello, and that the relic given to Adalbert was actually of more recent manufacture. However, if this is so, there is no trace of a relic of St. James in Torcello in more recent times. When Adalbert died in 1072, the relic of St. James was seized by the emperor's son, the future Heinrich IV, seen here on the left, and it became part of the imperial crown jewels. There is no evidence of any miracles attached to the relic, but it may have been used in ceremonies of vassalage, the swearing of loyalty by a feudal subject. The next emperor was Heinrich V, to the right, who forced his father to abdicate and even imprisoned him in 1105. And this is where Henry I comes into the story. His first child, Matilda, was born in 1102. When she was only 6 in 1108, negotiations began for her future marriage to the emperor, and at the age of 8, she was escorted to Germany to be taught German and imperial court etiquette in preparation for her marriage. This took place in 1114, shortly before Matilda's 12th birthday. And in 1117, along with her husband, Matilda was crowned empress in Rome, not by the Pope, who'd been forced to withdraw to Monte Cassino by the imperial forces, but by the Archbishop of Braga, Maurice Bourdin, later the anti-Pope Gregory VIII. Matilda's marriage to Heinrich seems to have been happy, despite their difference in age. He was about 16 years older than her, but they had no children, at least none who survived. Sadly, in 1125, the emperor died of cancer, aged only 39, bequeathing the emblems of imperial power, including the hand, to his wife. Heinrich was buried in Speyer Cathedral, the last of the Salian line of emperors. Matilda could have entered a convent, as was normal for widowed queens without a surviving son for whom to be regent, but fell in with her father, King Henry's wishes that she should return to England. You may recall that Henry had lost his only legitimate son, William Adelin, in the White Ship disaster of 1120. His first wife, Matilda of Scotland, had died in 1118, and he was now married to Adeliza of Louvain, but she was still childless. When Matilda accompanied her father back to England in 1126, she brought with her part of her regalia, including 2 crowns similar to this one. The hand, which was said to be enclosed within a beautiful golden reliquary encrusted with jewels, had apparently been sent on ahead by the king to his new monastery at Reading, which had become an independent abbey in 1123. This is a translation of part of the document from the Reading Abbey cartularies, confirming King Henry's gift of the hand to the abbey. It is dated September 1126, but as Kemp states in his collection of the cartularies, it is either forged or corrupt in its present form, for the witnesses include Roger Bigod, who died in 1107, and Ranulph the Chancellor, who died in 1123, that is, before the death of Matilda's husband, the emperor. However, as with other charters and deeds of gift, it may be a later version of the original document. Why did Matilda choose to keep the hand, and why was Henry so keen to bring it to Reading? Maybe Matilda had a particular devotion to the saint whose Jakobsweg passed through her adopted country. In Henry's case, the motives may have been more related to dynastic ambition, in that he wanted to bring the prestige of the Jacobean cult to his own foundation. The cult of St. James was closely entwined with the Cluniac Benedictine order, who, as we have seen, were responsible for many hostels along the pilgrimage routes to Compostela. Henry was at the time responsible, and the film was patron of Cluny, and had largely funded the rebuilding of the basilica after its roof had collapsed in 1125, so he probably jumped at the chance to bring such a prestigious relic to his new foundation. And possibly there was a more personal motive. Henry's own mother-in-law, St. Margaret of Scotland, had taken a great interest in the shrine of St. Andrew at Kilrimond in Fife. Andrew, the brother of Simon Peter, and since the 9th century the patron saint of Scotland, was another of Jesus' first disciples. His bones were said to have been brought to Scotland by a Pictish king in the 8th century. Margaret, the wife of Malcolm III Canmore, the name in Gaelic means great chief, endowed pilgrims' hostels and a ferry across the Firth of Forth to bring them to the shrine. This donation is recorded in the name Queen's Ferry. These pilgrims' badges are from the shrine. By Henry's time, St. Andrew's Shrine was a popular destination, and Henry may well have hoped to emulate its fame and its attraction to pilgrims, who would help fund his new monastery and the local economy of Reading. The exact date of the relic's arrival in Reading has been debated, but there seems little doubt that after Henry's death in 1135, the hand was taken to Winchester by Henry of Blois, bishop of that city and brother of the new king, Stephen, who had seized the throne, instigating 19 years of the anarchy, when he and Matilda contested the right to rule. Bishop Henry commissioned this enamelled plaque, one of a pair. In translation, part of the inscription reads, "May the angel take the giver to heaven, but not yet, lest England groan for it, since on him it depends for peace or war, agitation or rest." He was not an overly modest man. According to Matthew Paris, writing in the 13th century, the Reading monks complained that the hand had been taken unjustly, and the relic was returned to Reading in 1155. One chronicler, Thomas Rudburn of Winchester, reported that the bishop had removed the thumb and given it to Winchester, but this seems unlikely, as representations of the hand on the abbey seals show a complete thumb, and certainly the hand in Marlow is intact. In the second half of the 12th century, in the reign of Henry II, the hand became famous as the source of many miraculous healings and other marvels. We know about these through a document called The Miracles of the Hand of St. James. It was written around the year 1200, probably by a monk at Reading, or possibly Leicester, as the writing is very similar to that used in the abbey cartularies. At the dissolution of the monasteries, it was apparently lost, but in the following 17th century, a Herefordshire squire presented it to Gloucester Cathedral. Very probably he was part of a Catholic family which had kept it hidden. They may have worried that it would bring them persecution if they were known to possess it. The cathedral have very kindly allowed us to show images of the text, which was used by Professor Kemp over many years to produce his elegant translation from the original Latin, with both versions appearing in his New Miscellany. The cult of miracles was widespread in the 12th century, particularly after the murder of Becket in 1170. An interesting paper, The Medieval Pilgrimage Business, by Adrian Bell and Richard Dale of the Henley Business School, discusses the way in which collections of miracle stories similar to this one can be compared to modern advertising techniques, encouraging pilgrims to visit a particular shrine in the hope of witnessing or experiencing miraculous cures, and, of course, to boost the coffers of the pilgrimage site. Often, other pilgrimage sites and their saints are denigrated as being less likely to provide cures. There are 28 miracle stories in The Miracles of the Hand of St. James, and they tell us a great deal about religious devotion and about life at the time, both in Reading and elsewhere in England. We know that the hand was normally enclosed in a reliquary, which would have been shown to pilgrims as a sign of God's blessing. Many of the cures came about through sprinkling with water in which the hand had been dipped. For example, a terrible head tumour in a Reading monk was cured when a linen cloth was dipped in St. James's water and wrapped around his head. Within 2 days, we are told, he was restored to perfect health and went in procession with the rest of the monks. To give a flavour of these wonderful stories, I am going to read extracts from 3 of them. Notice Brian Kemp's beautiful storytelling style. You may want to imagine a monk reading aloud, perhaps to his fellow monks in the refectory. One very poignant story concerns a boy called William, a native of Reading. From his birth, nature had so punished him by the awful laws of her indignation that, with both legs shrunken, he was regarded as a spastic. Moreover, his legs were so thin that they appeared no thicker than a human thumb. On Christmas Eve, however, the people had assembled in the church in their annual devotion and were listening to the divine mysteries when the aforesaid boy was carried to the church and set down in front of the altar, which the people have been accustomed to call the altar of St. James. He seemed to be cured from heaven and to receive strength in those limbs which had been seized by lameness. Indeed, the withered and shrunken sinews began to slacken and become moist, and his bones began to grow and harden. As a result, the boy stood upright, supporting himself by the pillar standing to the right of the altar, where he had lain. Hitherto he'd been unaccustomed to standing upright and incapable of walking, and so he was afraid to trust himself, because he lacked confidence in his ability and strength. After a little while he mastered the basic principles of walking and climbed up the steps to the altar, a difficult operation for the feet of a disabled person. And in order to show by whose merits he had been raised up, he stopped in front of the picture of the Blessed James painted there and grasped the ends of the altar as though he were giving thanks to his Saviour or trying to embrace him. Throughout the night and Christmas Day he could not and would not be drawn away by any assault of the cold or any pangs of hunger or thirst. On Christmas evening he went away healed, and there remain no longer any signs of his lameness. A second story seems particularly appropriate in these pandemic days. It involves the relic being carried on what was called a feretory, similar to this one for the relics of St. Alban. The Lord magnified his saints in many places and in many ways. In Reading there occurred at one time a disastrous and fatal plague, which laid low young boys and girls as well as old folk, and gathered a rich harvest of people with the daughters of its quiver. And at that time, within the space of one short year, 13 monks of Reading Abbey were carried off, and of the rest very many of the convent were exceedingly ill. And since there was nobody to help them, they called upon the Lord to rescue them from their growing danger, and to send a strong wind through the air. Accordingly, an important decision was taken, and it was decreed that a fast be proclaimed, and the people to be congregated in the church, where special liturgies would be sung, and they would perambulate the town in a well-ordered general procession, in the hope of placating God by the protection of the blessed James, whose hand they bore aloft. And this was done. The sick were laid out in the streets, the dead being kept indoors, so that they might look upon the reliquary which contained the sacred hand, and be delivered from their infirmities. And indeed, as many can witness, almost everyone who saw it on that day was made well, whatever the sickness from which they were suffering, because power came forth from it and healed them all. On the same day, and at the same hour, the affliction ceased. The grief of the people was allayed, and the indignation of the Lord appeased. So, when all these things had been accomplished, each returned home joyfully, and from that day onwards they have been free from that kind of plague. Finally, here is the story of a miraculous cure from blindness of a huntsman from the north of England. From it we learn of the use of candles, used to symbolize the pilgrim's devotion. In many ways, the story is reminiscent of a fairy tale, and the unknown monk who wrote them clearly had great talents as a storyteller. This story is important in that it includes the information that at certain times the relic was placed on the pulpitum, the screen between the nave, which was for the congregation, and the chancel, the area reserved to the monks, where they sang the office several times a day. We even know that the bishop who performed this was Gilbert Folio, the Bishop of London, between 1163 and 1187, allowing us to date the miracle fairly precisely. In the north of England, there was a certain rich man's keeper of hounds named Gilbert, who was over-fond of the vanity of the chase, and, drawing no distinction between one day and another, believed that vanity and pleasure were permitted on any day. On St. James's Day, he cantered into the wood to hunt, paying no regard to the feast, and failing to show due reverence to the apostle. And with his hounds he pursued a stag, and keeping on its heels for a good while, he eventually caught it. But when he proceeded to congratulate himself on his prize, the vengeance of the Lord came upon him, for salty perspiration seemed to run into his eyes, and entirely cut off his vision. When he tried to wipe it away, he wiped away his sight as well. At length, he just managed to grope his way to his horse and mounted, and putting trust not in himself, but in the intelligence of his steed, he attempted the journey home. Eventually, with difficulty and in pain, he got back, but for a long time he remained blind, and, unable to be cured by ointments or remedies, he began to become a burden to those among whom he had previously been very popular. In his adversity he found few friends, in his poverty very few, and in his blindness scarcely any physicians. As in the saying, when you are successful you will number many friends, in bad times you will be alone. Bound by poverty and grief, he sat in darkness and the shadow of death. Barely his wife alone had stayed with him to guide him, and she took him everywhere around the shrines of saints, but in vain, for nowhere could he regain his sight. But after a long time it pleased the Lord to put an end to his affliction and provide a cure for his blindness. And so blessed James appeared to him in a dream, and ordered him to go to Reading, if he wished to receive the light of his eyes. In the morning the man arose, and, with his wife's guidance, hastened to Reading, in the hope which the dream had given him. Having arrived there, he stayed for some considerable time, but experienced no improvement, and impatient at the wait and losing hope, he decided to go home blind. He therefore left Reading and got as far as Banbury, where, again in a dream, he was rebuked and urged to return to Reading, make himself a candle, and await the promised cure on the approaching feast of the Holy Apostle. He was brought back again to Reading, and with his candle was led into the monastery on the eve of Blessed James. The following day, the Lord Gilbert, Bishop of London, went up onto the screen, the pulpitum, and as he transferred the hand of the most holy apostle from the old reliquary to a new one, he blessed the people with it. And when he lifted it up and gave the blessing, the aforesaid man's eyes began to smart keenly and to gleam. Moreover, tears of blood flowed from his eye sockets and streamed down his cheeks. At that hour, in fact, and at that very moment, his eyes were opened. He raised his head and, turning to look at his candle, saw that it had burned down to the knotted fold, the bulge at the base of the candle, and would go out at any moment. He quickly picked up the candle and, as he pulled up the wick, broke out in praise of the most blessed James, and announced that he had received his sight, in witness of what had happened. Rejoicing then in the love and honour of the apostle, he served for many years in the guest house at Reading, until, inspired inwardly by a stricter vow, he went to Jerusalem, and rounded off his devotion laudably begun by a more renowned conclusion. We know that Henry II, Henry I's grandson, who came to the throne in 1154 after the chaos of the anarchy, had a great devotion to the hand, on one occasion asking for it to be brought to him before he set sail for Normandy. When the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa asked for the relic to be returned in 1157, Henry V's Chancellor, and then his great friend, Thomas Becket, wrote a polite but firm letter declining to return it, but offering instead a magnificent cope, no doubt embroidered in what was known as opus Anglicanum, or English work embroidery. It was Becket, appointed as Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162, who consecrated Reading Abbey 2 years later in 1164. However, Becket then fell out with Henry when he insisted on the right of clergy to be tried in special clerical courts. It's interesting that Henry's mother, Matilda, from her convent in Rouen, did her best to heal the quarrel before her death in 1167. 3 years later, Becket too was dead, martyred in his own cathedral in December 1170, and his cult, which began immediately and led to his canonization in 1173, probably eclipsed that of the hand to some extent as time went on. Richard I, needing money for his crusade, took the gold reliquary, but his successors, John and Henry III, made annual grants of gold and silver in compensation. Pilgrims would have bought badges such as this one, found in South Reading just a few years ago, showing the crest of the abbey. 3 of St. James's scallop shells. These still appear on the arms of Reading University and can be seen outside St. Lawrence's Church. At the time of the dissolution of the abbey in 1539, Thomas Cromwell sent one of his commissioners, John London, a former Catholic priest but now a zealous reformer, to Reading Abbey. In his report to Cromwell, London reported that he had the relics, which presumably included the hand, locked up behind the altar. However, it has been suggested that one of the monks had another key and was able to rescue the precious hand and conceal it in a wall of the abbey. Hugh Farrington, the abbot, was, of course, executed in front of his own abbey, and the great church was largely dismantled in the reign of Edward VI. For centuries it remained a ruin, and the story of the miraculous hand of St. James was forgotten, until, as we have seen, the discovery of the mummified hand in 1786. And that, as they say, is where we came in. Thank you.